Welcome to Bizarre Podcast.
The First World War started on the 28th of July 1914, and many people thought that the war would actually be over before Christmas. But as we all know, it sadly lasted until November the 11th, 1918, and by the end of World War I there was 20 million deaths and 21 million wounded. But today's story takes place only 5 months into the war, as Christmas Day approached. The war was still in its early days, but still an unimaginable number of lives had already been taken. Our story takes place on the Western Front, where trench warfare had started not long ago. On one side you had the British dug into their trenches, and on the other side you had the Germans dug into theirs. And in between there was no man's land, where many soldiers met their end in the mud and barbed wire, being riddled with bullets. When the trenches had first been dug out, the soldiers were in good spirits. The weather had been kind and the trenches were dry as a bone. However, this didn't last long, as the harsher months approached, bringing with them the harsher weather, mainly cold and rain, and the rain was relentless, filling up the trenches with brown yellow clay coloured waters. The soldiers on both sides were now living in a horrendous mud-filled hole. Watery thick clay was all around. Think of it like sinking sand. Many soldiers became stuck and found it difficult to get out, and on some occasions when the walls of the trench would fall in on the soldiers, they would find it difficult to get out in the wet mud and would drown right there in their own trench amongst the rats. But despite how horrendous this all sounded, the trench was actually the safest spot they could be in. If anyone tried to get out of their trench, they would be shot by snipers on the other side, who were sometimes only about 50 yards away in their trenches across no man's land, where machine gun fire was also constant. Both sides lived this way in these horrendous conditions for quite some time, until one day the rain stopped, only to be replaced by the bitter bite of winter, the frost. Christmas was approaching fast. Meanwhile in Rome, the Pope was desperately trying to achieve a ceasefire on Christmas Day, in hopes that all sides could celebrate the holy day and hopefully make everyone re-evaluate just why they fought in this war, and hopefully a permanent ceasefire would follow that would end the war. However, leaders on all sides of the war all refused. There would be no peace this Christmas. It would seem war had no place for a truce, even a brief one. Back on the Western Front, the waters had receded and the muddy clay turned into a frozen solid state as icy frost and snow covered the ground and fell into the trenches. The men knew that no ceasefire had been agreed upon, and to disobey a direct order was considered treason. Life for both the English and the Germans were tough in the trenches. Both sides would have been missing their loved ones, especially at this time of the year, and in an attempt to boost morale, both sides received a number of gifts. The soldiers received gifts such as cigars, pipes, tobacco, sweets, Christmas cards, not to mention gifts sent from family members sending personal packages, all in an attempt to boost morale on these harsh cold days and nights, at a bleak time when these soldiers didn't know whether today would be their last. You see, both sides constantly lived in fear whether today would be the day that the enemy would attack. There would be days when orders were given for them to venture out into no man's land and meet the enemy head on, and obviously not everyone would return. And every now and again a lucky shot from an enemy sniper would take away someone's best friend. As you can imagine, to say that the English didn't think very fondly of the Germans and the Germans didn't think very fondly of the English would have been quite an understatement. Christmas Eve morning had arrived, and the Germans had planted small fir trees which they decorated with candles and positioned them all along the edges of the trenches. All of these beautiful little trees twinkled out across no man's land, illuminating the frozen snowy ground. When the sun had gone down, some of the British soldiers appeared out from their trench, and what they saw really must have been a glorious sight, at a time when a little Christmas spirit was really needed. At first sight, some of the British soldiers weren't sure what they were looking at and feared an attack. And then it dawned on them, they were actually looking at little Christmas trees. At some point in the night, as the British sat at their posts in their trenches, all of a sudden they heard Christmas carols being sung by the Germans. Although not being sung in their language, the British knew straight away what they were listening to. The Germans were singing Stille Nacht, the German version of Silent Night. And what else could the British do but sit there and listen? Once the Germans had finished singing their Christmas carol, the British decided to sing some of their own. Each side would start taking the turn singing Christmas carols, and at first it was as if they were trying to outdo each other, and then something amazing happened. Now this quote I'm going to read you is actually from one of the British soldiers in the trenches at this time. First the Germans would sing one of their carols, and then we would sing one of ours, until when we started up O Come All Ye Faithful, the Germans immediately joined in singing the same hymn to the Latin words Adeste Fideles, and I thought, well, this is really a most extraordinary thing. Two nations singing the same carol in the middle of a war. And so it would seem that a German and English choir was formed as they sang to each other over no man's land. They sang carols together for most of the night, and then eventually when the last carol ended, one of the Germans shouted out from his trench. The German shouted, "Come over, Tommy." This was a nickname that the Germans had chosen for the British. And then something amazing happened. A solitary figure ascended nervously from his trench, his place of safety, and bravely made his way across the artillery-torn barbed wire hell that was no man's land, where soldiers from both sides lay dead where they fell. And in the middle, an English officer and a German officer met, shook hands, and shared a drink of whiskey. They came to an agreement: if you don't shoot, we don't shoot. And right there on that certain spot on the Western Front, the truce was agreed upon. On Christmas Day, it was understood that there would be an unofficial ceasefire. The next morning the sun rose on Christmas Day. It was a cold sunny day, and the sun shined on the thin blanket of snow that dusted the ground. Once the British awoke, they were shocked to see the Germans walking around out of their trenches. Such a thing would simply have been considered suicide on any other day. Somewhat reassured by this, the British did the same. Once out of the trenches, soldiers from both sides who had been trapped in their own trenches for so long saw the true horror of war. All around them, dead bodies of each side's soldiers lay on the frozen ground. Now of course both sides knew that these dead bodies had been there all along, but to actually see them in broad daylight from outside of the trench would have been a horrific sight. So both sides walked amongst each other, collecting their dead, and dug graves in the frozen ground, and both sides showed their respects for one another's dead, and held joint services. Slowly, the Germans all come up from the safety of their camp, and so did the British, and they met in the middle of no man's land, and exchanged handshakes and kind words and smiles, and even started to exchange Christmas presents with each other. Exchanging alcohol, plum puddings, chocolate bars, cigarettes, and they actually tried on each other's uniforms, which I believe has actually been captured in some very old photographs from that day. One English soldier even asked a German soldier if he could take a button off his coat, and the German soldier happily obliged. More and more parts of the Western Front saw what was happening and followed suit, nervous at first, but eventually they started to relax and fraternise with the supposed enemy. And one German barber even offered haircuts to the British soldiers. Spirits were high that Christmas Day. They laughed, they joked, they admired, and they both showed their sadness that they were even a part of this war. There was even a story of a British and a German soldier having a conversation about why they were fighting in the war. The German replied that he is fighting for freedom for his country. The British soldier replied, "How can that be? For I am fighting for freedom for my country." It was seen both men were fighting for the same thing, and no thoughts of laying a claim on one another's homes came into it. The German soldier believed that God was on his side, whereas the British soldier believed that God was on his side. The Germans and the British spent all of Christmas Day together, and even broke out a football and had a friendly match. But sadly this couldn't last, it just couldn't be. And as Christmas Day came to an end, both soldiers from both sides shook hands and parted ways with a newfound admiration and respect, knowing that the next time they meet, it wouldn't be on such good terms, and blood would be spilt. According to the stories, the truce lasted a couple of days after Christmas going into the new year. As you can imagine, it had probably become quite hard for both sides to actually open fire on each other from this day on. And then words of the unofficial ceasefire got to the generals, and strict orders were sent down. The orders were that there would be no more fraternising with the enemy. It would seem some sides were ordered to open fire on the enemy to break the state of mind the men were in. And the Germans were even told that if they showed any compassion in any way for the enemy, then they would be considered enemies and shot dead. So as we all know, the war did go on, but for one brief moment on Christmas Day, mortal enemies met in a field of pointless death and destruction and showed feelings of fondness, respect and admiration, brought together because of the Christmas spirit and the humanity that we all have inside of us.